aprite il microfono, grazie. Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Il soprannome del relatore di questo incontro la dice lunga su quello che ascolterete oggi. È direttore del laboratorio di archeologia biomolecolare per la cucina, le bevande fermentate e la salute dell'Università di Filadelfia. Da anni gira il mondo alla ricerca di birre antiche e vini fermentati, in un miscuglio fra quella che è la ricerca, l'innovazione, la tradizione e la storia. Signori e signori, Patrick McGovern.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. And I do have a special drink that I will be talking about this evening, which is called Etrusca. I think you know about the Etruscans. And unfortunately, I could not bring enough for everyone that's here. But afterwards, you may be able to get a little sip. We'll see what happens. But I want to thank everyone for inviting me for the conference. And first, I would just take a sip myself. So, chin chin. I may take more as I go along. But I'm very happy to be here in Mantova. And I've never been here before. I have been to Soave and to Torino for a Salone del Gusto, where we did a program on the archaeology of beer. You'll see some of the people that are part of that program that we've done. I am a combination archaeologist chemist, so it's very unusual to be both. And this has led me into this field of identifying chemically ancient foods and beverages. And so we've identified the earliest wine, the earliest beer, and you'll see we also have some very strange beverages, which we call extreme beverages or hybrid beverages that have many different ingredients in them. And so if you look at the archaeological evidence, and this is the cover of my latest book, which I do have a few copies here if anyone's interested. It brings together all the data that we have for various kinds of beverages around the world. So humans would have come out of Africa, say, about 100,000 years ago, our species. And then we went around the world, basically, discovering all sorts of fermented beverages, because we happen to be a very innovative, I think alcoholic beverages, as you'll see, are part of our physiological makeup. And they've had a lot to do with our cultural development. So we take the various evidences that we have, which could be archaeological, so it helps if you're an archaeologist. And then I have a chemistry background, so we do all sorts of studies with things like liquid chromatography, gas chromatography, but for the chemically challenged among you, I will try not to give you all the details. You can go to my website, and if you want to see the detailed arguments that we make about the chemistry. And then we also have information we can get from ancient texts and artwork. So I studied a lot of ancient languages, and especially Mesopotamia, like hieroglyphics, Egyptian, and Akkadian from Mesopotamia, Latin, Greek, of course, and so forth. So sometimes you get information from the textual evidence that would be very helpful in interpreting the chemical and archaeological data. So you have to go through that, but you have to also be careful because the writers sometimes get it wrong. They may not be first-hand witnesses, for instance, and that can lead to some mistakes in how they present the information. And the same with the artwork. Some of the earliest depictions we have in tombs in Egypt, going back to 3000 BC, are winemaking and beer making. And so you get some ideas about how the wine was made, how the beer was made, and that can be helpful, but you also have to be careful because they keep repeating the same pictures over and over for 3,000 years. So it must have changed in that period. And you just have to take the archaeological evidence and see what you get. And then finally, botanical studies are very important. The plants that go into these beverages. So we have to work not just with the chemical evidence and the archaeological evidence, but also the botanical evidence. Now the ethnography, because fermented beverages are very central to human culture, they can be perpetuated for many centuries. And so if we look at modern people today, like in Africa, we have thousands of different cultures and languages being spoken in Africa. They usually will have a fermented beverage that is right at the center of their culture. So you could have a millet beer. And sometimes they put the brewery right at the center of the village. So all the activities, the social, religious activities, economic activities are centered on that brewery, and you are able to communicate with the ancestors that way, and so forth. And then finally we have what is called experimental archaeology. Now this is sort of the fun part, but it's also very instructive, where we try to recreate, based on the evidence that we have, the beverage. And of course, you cannot get 100% certainty, because archaeologically you only have a certain amount of information, very little of the organic material. And then you have to make assumptions like, humans, we basically have the same sensory organs right from the beginning. So, you would know if something tasted bad or, was, a little bit off on the taste or the whatever. But then some people like that. Some people like sour beers, and some people like sweet. So it varies, from culture to culture and from individual to individual. But there is a point at which, you probably, if you're the king or an upper official, that you're going to want to have a very fine beverage that's going to taste very good and will appeal to all your senses. So this book, besides talking about how humans have developed different beverages around the world, it also has homebrew recipes, which, if you're a home brewer, you can try to make some of these beverages yourself. And then we make suggestions about what music maybe you should play as you're drinking that beverage, and what clothes, like maybe some Egyptian, or Chinese dragon robe, let's say, that you should wear, maybe what kind of perfume you should have on. And this will make you travel back into the past. Now, I mentioned that the recreations we did of this beverage, we did actually work with two very enterprising microbrewers, craft brewers here in Italy. I suppose some of you know Casa Belladin, which is in Piozzo, near the Longa area, which was I stayed there while we were doing the event in Torino at the Salone d'Agosto. And of course, it also gave me the opportunity to go have Barolo wines and Barbaresco wines, so it's a very nice place to be. And he has an interesting house that has lots of modernistic and sort of primitivist artwork that he is using, and he has done himself and puts up in the house. And then the other brewer that we worked with was Leonardo da Vincenzo, who is near Rome, up in the Apennine Mountains. And the time that we went there was in March, and there was still snow on the ground. And then we did an experimental brewing with him in pottery jars that were in the form of the early Etruscan vessels. So this is from 800 to 700 BC. He had a local potter make it from local clay, and then he did the fermentation in that vessel. Now, Teo Mussi of Belladin, his father was a winemaker, so he used oak barrels. And that we don't know for sure whether the Etruscans had oak barrels, but they were able to make ships. So presumably they knew how to make a barrel and to produce a wine. This is the American version coming from Delaware. A very interesting brewery. It's like the most experimental brewery in the United States, called Dogfish Head. And the name Dogfish Head comes from a place in the state of Maine. And the owner and the brewer of that brewery, Sam Calagione, who his ancestry is from Calabria, so he has a lot of Italian interest behind him. He has experimented with all kinds of beverages, and so he's the one I've done most of these recreations with over the last 20 years. And there's another one that I brought with me, is the first one. It's called Midas Touch, which I'll talk about a little bit, based on residues of vessels in a tomb in central Turkey, from about the same time period, actually, as the Etruscan one. So he used bronze vessels to do the fermentation, because we have evidence from the early Etruscan period that bronze was also used. Now, these just give you some of the various beverages that we've recreated. So I've talked about Etrusca, for the Mediterranean area, and then Midas Touch for Turkey. I'm going to say a few words about the Chinese beverage, which is the earliest one we've identified from 7000 BC. I won't talk about the Egyptian or African beverage, although that would be very interesting because we all come from Africa, and so that is a very interesting beverage to think about. And I will not talk about the Americas. This is a chocolate. We identified some of the earliest chocolate, and we think that chocolate was domesticated because there is a pulp around the beans. There's about 20 or 30 beans inside the fruit, and the pulp has about 20% sugar. And you can make an alcoholic beverage when you ferment the pulp to get to the beans. So that's a very interesting beverage. We think that may be the reason that early Americans, or our ancestors basically, when they came across from Siberia, they got interested in the cacao, the chocolate tree, because they could make this particular alcoholic beverage. And in general, that's the case with almost all these beverages, whether they're made from barley, rice, corn, whatever. We think that the impetus often for domesticating the plant was to make a fermented beverage. And you domesticate in order to make more of that particular cereal or fruit, and then control the process better so that you're able to make a lot more of it. And I'll say a few words about the corn, chicha, which is also down here in Peru too, which they still make today. I'll say something about that. So what we have is, we start out with maybe some artwork. This is Mycenaean from about 1200 BC, where you have two women, holding a cup in between themselves. And we would like to know, what is inside that cup? Is it wine? Is it beer? Or is it some sort of very extreme kind of beverage? And so we go through a whole process of taking the pottery sherds that we have, and then the pottery is very good because it absorbs the liquid. And the liquid then is kept in the pores, and it is chemically bound to the clay. And then we come along thousands of years later, let's say, and we're able to use a organic solvent like methanol or chloroform, and we're able to take out the ancient organic and then do all of our analyses. So, this is a very complicated process, actually. And, you might think, oh, well, we just have to go excavate the pottery, get the sample, and then do the analysis, but we have to figure out a lot of different things about it. So it's always good to have, fellow scientists that are working on this, and Sam Calagione, who is a very experimental brewer, to be able to work together and really see if we can do a recreation like Etrusca, and then try to imagine what that beverage was used for. So a lot of times it's going to be religious in nature or social. But I'd like to back off a little bit before I get into the beverages by showing you how important alcohol is in the universe. Now, you may not know this, but in the center of the Milky Way, if you had a very good telescope like the astronomers have, and you looked out toward the center, there are these huge clouds of alcohol, especially where the stars are forming. Now, these alcohols include ethanol, methanol, different kinds of more reactive alcohols that can form more complex compounds. They're located quite a distance away, maybe about 26,000 light years. But of course, 26,000 light years is nothing compared to the age of the universe. The universe is, maybe 8.6 billion years or whatever. And so, we have lots of other galaxies out there, and in the star-forming regions, there are many of these clouds of gases. So, if we had the space vehicle to get there, we could mine, maybe some of that alcohol. But we do have a lot of alcohol right here on our planet itself. Now, the other thing that the astronomers were able to determine was that there are other compounds besides alcohol that are found in these very large clouds with billions of liters. And one of those is ethyl formate, which interestingly gives some of the flavor to raspberry, and then also smells of rum. And so, it's a very enticing mixture that's out there. But if we come down then to the Earth itself, we can make a case that the earliest energy producing method that was done on the planet Earth was fermentation. So fermentation is really at the basis of life on this planet. And you then begin to understand why it is so much a part of our lives, and also lives of other animals and plants and so forth, because there's a basic process called glycolysis, where sugar is converted into alcohol and into carbon dioxide. And we are very much set up to enjoy alcohol. And this is Sam Calagione to my right here at one of our Pennsylvania Museum events. And so the anaerobic glycolysis without oxygen is something that the yeast, which we cannot see visually, it's microscopic, it carries out the same process and represents in a way the single cells that were there at the beginning and has developed since then as the prime producer of alcohol and of carbon dioxide. So we can sort of think of the Earth as being surrounded in an alcoholic carbonated medium for a very long time, and that was the context in which life on this planet developed. So if we look at us, today, we have, 50 trillion cells in our body, and they're using like a modified glycolysis method to get energy. So all of us are producing, even in our bodies right now, the energy we need, and coming from sugar and alcohol, because 10% of the enzymes in our liver convert alcohol into energy as well. And these enzymes, they include ones that start out in our mouth. I mean, we have the ability to smell and to taste alcohol and different aromatic compounds. But then we have an enzyme that maybe arose about 10 million years ago, before there were even humans, that's called ADH, which is alcohol dehydrogenase. And there's different varieties of this. So we have one in our mouth and down through our gut. And then our liver has, like I say, 10% of this particular enzyme. And then, so when we drink alcoholic beverage, we're really getting an energy boost at first. Now, we also get all the neurotransmitters in our brain that are unleashed. So we have things like dopamine, serotonin, and other compounds that give us pleasure. So as you drink alcohol, you know, if I drink this now, and I hope I don't get too drunk, I'm unleashing different neurotransmitters in my brain that then are giving me some pleasure. And so this is another reason why you might want to, besides the smell, the aroma, the energy, how fermentation preserves things, this might be another reason why you might drink a fermented beverage. But I think that in general, the whole system that we see around us today goes back millions of years to the Cretaceous period when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, because then we have the first honeybees, we have the first fruit flies, we have the first fruiting trees that give very high sugar that can be fermented, and we have honey, of course. Now, the honey, in this case, we have honeybees that are embedded from 100 million years ago in a tree resin called amber, which solidifies. And these are two fruit flies that are mating. Now, fruit flies actually feed their young alcohol. I mean, we were always told on the outside of the bottle, you know, don't give this to, you know, a woman who's nursing or, you know, having a baby. But in fact, the fruit fly, which is very attracted to alcohol and sugar, feeds its young with that. And we can also think of different kinds of especially flying creatures, you know, dinosaurs could be this too, that are eating the fruit that could be fermenting and producing alcohol, and also they're pollinating at the same time. They're picking up the pollen and transferring it. So we have a very intricate system of both enjoying an alcoholic medium and also allowing the plants to perpetuate themselves. And I don't know how many of you have seen drunk animals, but this is also a very common phenomenon in nature, especially among birds who are the descendants of the dinosaurs, the flying dinosaurs. The ones here on the left are waxwings, Bohemian waxwings, and they're eating fermented apples. So they're eating like an applejack. And this particular owl from Germany was found beside the road with 2 empty bottles of schnapps next to it. And it was, you know, basically didn't know what it was doing. So it had to be taken to an animal recovery area and given some water, and it recovered, okay. But we have the same genes in our bodies for drunkenness, inebriation. And they go by very fanciful names, and they're the same as the fruit fly and the bee have, which are things like amnesiac, cheap date, happy hour. So the scientists have come up with these sort of strange names to describe the genes for drunkenness. And the reason we might get drunk is you only have the fruit at certain times of the year. So when you have the fruit and it's starting to mature and ripen, and you have the possibility of getting alcohol, then you would want to eat as much as you could. And we're really sort of set up then for both moderate drinking in general, because you wouldn't have all the fruit that you wanted all the year, or the situation in which you would drink or eat a lot of the fruit that had ripened, and that would get you drunk. And so if we keep coming up toward ourselves, the earliest primate on the planet is thought to be this Malaysian tree shrew going back 55 million years. And its diet is quite interesting. It drinks it has a fermented palm nectar that it consumes all night long. So the palm nectar, you know, is coming out of the tree. It is drinking the equivalent of about 9 glasses of wine per night. And that is what it mainly eats or drinks. And this is the earliest primate on the planet. And so that leads on to a hypothesis that's called the drunken monkey hypothesis. This is a very early primate that then leads on to all the other primates, the apes and the chimpanzees and so forth, and ultimately to us. And there is a book now that has been published by a University of California professor who did studies in Central America of how different monkeys will consume fermented fruit, and it's quite common. And if we have other experiments that are less controlled, in which especially chimpanzees, which are closest to us genetically, if they are given the opportunity to drink anything they want, they have an open bar, so they could have whatever. The males in particular will drink like 2 or 3 bottles of wine right away. I mean, this is just the way primates behave. So we have that, plus we have the Paleolithic hypothesis, which if we take humans back 2 million years or even longer, the idea would be that humans very early discovered what a fermented beverage was and started making it and drinking it. So it would be like the earliest biotechnology on the planet. And so some of the early hominid forms, that, like this one from South Africa, if you look at them closely, especially the teeth, there is calculus or plaque that they're able to analyze isotopically, and also looking for the kinds of plants and so on that they would, phytoliths, that they would be eating, and they generally are fruits. In fact, we still have very small teeth that's best adapted, and most primates are adapted to this, to eat a soft food like a fruit, some grain, and so this seems to indicate that our diet, would be directed toward fruit, primarily at this stage. So this got me thinking about the Paleolithic hypothesis, and we don't have the evidence for this because, unfortunately, we do not have a container from the Paleolithic period. There is no remaining vessel that has ever been found for that 2 million years. We first start to find material that we can work with when we have pottery. So pottery has to be invented, and that occurs in the Middle East around 6000 BC, in China much earlier, 16,000 BC. And once we have pottery, then we're able to do the analysis. But we can imagine that they had leather, wood, and they could make a vessel, and they would maybe take some fruit, which the interesting thing about fruit too is it often has very bright colors, and we are visually oriented. So like when we see a very colorful necklace, let's say, we're attracted to it. So when we see that bright fruit, we would take it and collect it somehow, maybe in a leather, like a wineskin, and you'd leave it, and you start eating the fruit. You collect as much as you could, you start eating it, but the fruit is pushing down on what's below, and juice is coming out, and that juice will be fermented by the yeast that's associated with the high sugar fruit. So by the time our ancient ancestor, gets to the bottom of the barrel and starts to smell, there's something very strange going on here. There's some kind of a fermentation, aromatic properties that are occurring. Then they would drink it, get the mind-altering effect, and the rest is history, as you might say. The only trouble would be they would have this Stone Age Beaujolais Nouveau, or sour ale or mead, but they had no way to keep it. They didn't have a glass bottle with a cork, so you had to drink it very quickly. And that would be the challenge that we all face, right? And I've mentioned, how fermentation is a very dynamic process. Even though humans could not see the yeast, they could see all the carbon dioxide coming off the fermenting beverage, the liquid. And so that would be like a mystery. It'd be like something extraordinary, almost like a supernatural power, is working to produce this beverage. And if you did it in a jar like this, which used to be the earliest identified wine jar from Iran that's in the Pennsylvania Museum, but recently we've discovered earlier from Georgia in the Caucasus. If you did the fermentation and you had all this carbon dioxide coming off, you can imagine that the vessel itself would start to move. And this would be also very strange. So then you begin to understand how these fermented beverages get incorporated into religions, like wine into Christianity, rice, beer into Chinese religion, and so forth, and of course all through Africa. Some of the other properties of these alcoholic beverages is it breaks down the boundaries between people. So we have what is called social lubrication, in which you're drinking the beverage, you're feeling very good, and you still see this today. I mean, if we went to the reception last night, people, when they start drinking alcoholic beverages, they come together and so on. It also is very important as the earliest medicine, because you just try to imagine if you were living 100,000 years ago and you don't have a synthetic medicine, what are you going to do? Well, the alcoholic beverage takes away the pain, it puts you to sleep, it's an antiseptic, it kills the bad bacteria, it's better than water. I mean, water would be dangerous, but an alcoholic beverage, would be much safer. And also it takes, if you have an herb, if you have some special plant that you think may have some medicinal value, the alcohol will put it into solution better than water. So you're able to then administer it by drinking it. And so we understand, and the pharmacopoeias of Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, and Rome, I mean, they all involve alcoholic beverages because that was the universal medicine. And you see examples of this today. I mentioned in Africa. This is a case where they're making a beer from millet, and then they bury the jar, the pottery jar, into the grave of the ancestor. And so first they would pour out some of the millet beer for the ancestor, and then they drink it with straws because you have different materials that are on the surface here, yeast and the grain and so forth that comes to the surface. So you use a straw. And this turns out to be the earliest way that beer was drunk all over the world. I mean, whether it's corn beer in the Americas or rice beer in China or here, millet beer. So now let's go on a little trip on some of these beverages and how we came up with them. First, we're going to go to China, because it's the earliest one. This comes from a site called Jiahu in the Yellow River Valley. And this site is early Neolithic, going back to 7,000 BC. It had tombs in which the pottery jars were placed very close to the head of the individual, maybe to help them drink in the afterlife. I mean, we don't know for sure, but all the burials are like this, and they've found many burials now. And this is some of the earliest pottery. It's also a site that has some of the earliest domesticated rice. It has flutes. It has the earliest playable musical instruments made out of the bone of a certain bird, the red-crowned crane, the wing bone. And the holes are drilled in such a way that you can still play traditional Chinese music on them. And they had the flautists from the Beijing orchestra, playing music. And there were maybe 3 dozen of these that were found. And so the flute, the music goes very closely, I think, with the fermented beverage. Because now today, even in China, the way you worship the ancestors is that you drink 9 very large goblets of rice wine, and one person does this, and they are the communicator with the ancestors. But if you drink like a 10% alcohol beverage, 9 glasses of it, you get drunk. And this actually is the way you communicate with the ancestors, because all the ancestors are drunk. And they also enjoyed these alcoholic beverages. So this is the way you're going to communicate with them. So this is the bird right here, the red-crowned crane, and its particular bone in the wing, the ulna. And this is the pottery that we analyzed from the tombs. You'll see they have very narrow mouths and very tall, so they're intended for a liquid. So we can make the archaeological case that a liquid was inside these vessels. You don't always see a residue, but we try to take the samples from the bottom here, where you might get more material settling out, and then we use those residues. And I was very fortunate the first time I went to China in 2000. I had a special trip all over the country to archaeological sites, and they're a drinking culture. So like at banquets, you're always, maybe many here have been to China, but if you have a banquet, you're all toasting one another through the whole meal. And so they were very interested in my taking samples because they still, in 2000, did not have the scientific instruments. And so they arranged, the Department of Antiquity to have samples brought back to the US. And then we published articles on Jiahu, which turned out to be so interesting. What we were able to discover was that the tartaric acid, which you also find in Vitis vinifera, in the grape, it also occurs in hawthorn fruit, which I don't know how many people are familiar with hawthorn fruit. We didn't know that it was had more than even grape in China, 4 times the amount. But then they did a botanical study, and the seeds of the only fruit that were found were grape and hawthorn fruit. So that, substantiated the chemical evidence. And it's probably a wild grape. We have no evidence of any grape. There are many other species besides Vitis vinifera in China, but we have no evidence that they ever domesticated any of those species. And then there was beeswax, which is very specific, and an ancient person could not have filtered out all the beeswax. So if we have a liquid inside a vessel, we assume it was diluted with water. And there are yeast in the honey that will then start the fermentation to mead. So this indicated that mead was there. And then we had some other esters that pointed to rice. So we had this very unusual mixture of a wine, a mead, and a beer. Something that seemed quite strange at the time. And of course, now these extreme beverages have become quite common. In the United States now, they're doing all kinds of, really crazy combinations. But, here's our ancestors already making these kinds of beverages. And this tends to be the case in all parts of the world, that they do these sort of mixed beverages. So you have the honey, and then as far as the rice, which is made into a beer because it's a cereal, you do have instances today where they're drinking the rice wine with straws, so that is curious. But you could break down the carbohydrates in the rice to sugar for the fermentation by several different methods. Now you can sprout it like barley, and you can make a malt, which they could have discovered quite easily. But the way I think that most of the earliest beverages were made was by chewing and spitting. So we have an enzyme in our saliva. I know this does not sound very appetizing, but we have an enzyme that allows us to break down the starch into sugar and then to spit it out, and some insect with some yeast on it comes by and starts the fermentation. So I think that's the earliest. So I told Sam Calagione at Dogfish Head, I said, I thought maybe that was the earliest. And he said, well, if you think it's the earliest, I think we should do it that way. We should chew the rice and spit it out. And I said, well, I don't think people are quite ready for that approach. We maybe should try something, like the malted approach. And so that's what we did the first time. But then later, we started to think about chicha from corn. And we did chew corn, Peruvian red corn, for 8 hours straight. Now, if you ever tried to chew something that hasn't been processed, it's very rough. And at the end of the 8 hours, our jaws were aching and we're all cut up on the inside of our mouths. But we did make a beer from it. And it turned out he became very interested in this, and he keeps having his employees. He has about 200 employees who, during the free time, when they have a break in the work, they chew and they collect all the liquid at the end of the day, and they still make this chicha. It can taste very good. We put, I mean, corn doesn't have I mean, of course you have polenta, and so you know about corn, but it doesn't have a real strong flavor. But we put some wild strawberries and also some pepper berries with it, which give a nice flavor. And but if you just have it plain, it tastes like a lager beer, and it's not so bad, really. And then we produced our recreation of this beverage, and there's a lot of details that you'd find in the book if you look at it. But I'll just finish a little bit on this this is the label, and we called it Chateau Jiahu. But at the time, this was 2004, this sort of pushed the envelope a little bit, but also the beverage inside was a combination of all kinds of ingredients, and I could talk about the yeast and so forth as well. But this was based on a dream that Sam had, and he does not allow me to tell you the rest of the dream. This is the only part I can tell you, is that he dreamt of this woman that had this tattoo. And that tattoo is very interesting because it is the sign in Chinese for any alcoholic beverage. So it's a jar that has 3 drops coming off the lip. And it's the only Chinese sign that I know. And so when I go to China and I'm getting thirsty, and I'm sure you are all getting thirsty too. And I see that sign, that sign on a sign, then I know I have some liquid refreshment, very close. And then we have a special thing that happened with the beverage, is that we got a gold tasting medal at the Great American Beer Festival in Colorado, which is the largest one, I think, in the world. And that was very exciting, and because Sam had already won other awards for Midas Touch, which I'll talk about next, he gave me the gold medal. And so then I came back to Philadelphia and I set up a little shrine with the pottery that we had analyzed. Here's some of the pottery, a base, and then the bottle, of course, and then the gold medal. So when I come in the morning to my laboratory, I can bow down to this special shrine and hope that we get more discoveries. Now I'm going to just say a few words about Midas Touch in Turkey. I don't know how many people here have been to Turkey, but there's a very important site called Gordian, which the Gordian knot, which Alexander the Great cut, you may know. And the University of Pennsylvania has been excavating there for over 40 years. And so they did an excavation of this very prominent site here. There's the palace over here. And this is the capital of the Phrygians. And there was a real King Midas. We have textual evidence to that effect. And this particular feature right here is called the Midas tumulus. And you might think it's just an ordinary hill, but it's actually an artificial construction over a tomb. So there is a tomb where where you see that purple rectangle there, and the University of Pennsylvania put a trench back in here, and they came on the tomb, which had a double row of logs defining the walls and the ceiling and the floor. So it was like a hermetically sealed chamber that contained the burial. And they had to cut through the logs, and then they could see in, like you might expect, looking into King Tut's tomb. And the king was there on, he was about 60 to 65 years old, died a natural death. He's lying on felt and textiles that were colored in blue and purple, which are the royal colors of the Near East. And then what interested me most was, of course, the largest Iron Age drinking set made out of bronze, okay? And this included drinking bowls and large cauldrons for making the beverage. They also had food that was served at a funerary feast for the king. Now, we don't know for sure if this is King Midas's tomb. I mean, we don't have a sign that says, you know, here lies King Midas. But the date of about 700 to 740 BC is approximately the time that he ruled, and his father Gordius. So it could be his father's tomb as well. We did a chemical analysis that was also able to reconstruct the food that was served at the funerary feast, and that was a barbecued, spicy lamb and lentil stew, which is very high in protein, very delicious. They still serve it at Turkish weddings, for instance. And then they washed it down with the Midas Touch golden elixir, which we had other residues that were inside vessels like this. And these are large buckets that were used to dip down into the large cauldrons that were used to make the beverage. So you might ask yourself, well, why are all these vessels made out of bronze, not gold? And because of the golden touch, but still, once you clean them up, they become very much like gold. And this is what the residues look like. And again, we did our analysis, and we got an extreme beverage. And this time we have grape only, and we have barley because we're in the Middle East. And so this is a very powerful beverage. You might not want to drink too much of it, but it tastes very good. It's won many gold tasting awards, silver also. But I'm going to move on here. The spice that we used for this was not hops, because hops come much, much later. So I suggested to Sam, why not use saffron? Well, saffron's the most expensive spice in the world. So this is the most expensive beer he ever made. He used the best saffron, and it's gone on to be a very popular beverage. And then we have Etrusca. Okay, I've got to say a few words about Etrusca. Because, I mean, after all, we're not too far from Tuscany and Etruria. I see it as starting from the Near East, I guess because maybe I'm a Near Eastern archaeologist, that the wine culture comes across the Mediterranean and it moves step by step over toward Italy. And we have many of these shipwrecks now that have been found. And I think that the Phoenicians and the Canaanites before them, with their ships made out of cedar, they would have brought the wine culture with them. And then the Etruscans then were able to get the domesticated grapevine, and then they planted their own vines, and then they were able to produce wine and then ship it over to southern France. So really, France owes Italy for having the earliest, the wine that was first introduced into France. The reason we think this is because the amphora of the Etruscans is very similar to the amphora of the Phoenicians. So what the vessel looks like is probably, it contains maybe the same thing. And we have other evidence, of course, too. So I've written about this. I had a book that was translated into Italian on ancient wine. And then I think also some Canaanite traditions like the drying of the grapes, the passito method, that you see in Valpolicella, is something that's taken by the Phoenicians. The earliest writings we have about the Carthaginians, Maggio, about growing grapes and making wine, is they dry the grapes. And it's a very similar process. And you also have like the Vansanto in Tuscany, and you have the Moscato de Pantelleria. You have many examples in Italy of this process. And so then we made a study of the vessels, especially the biconical craters, and they often have a mixed content of sometimes grapes, we think wild grapes, also different cereals, and they're often found in tombs that have been excavated. This is at Carmignano that we went to. This site down on the Ligurian Sea, Casola Marittimo is very interesting because it had pomegranate, hazelnut, apple, grape, and different kinds of very special vessels that look like wine skins and beehives and so forth. And these are of Near Eastern type, these drinking vessels, but there was honeycomb in the one that looked like a bee's hive. So we think that they combined, before the wine arrives, they had their own native beverage that was a combination of different ingredients. And so these are some of the ingredients that we used in the recreation of this beverage. There was also evidence of myrrh that has to be imported from Somalia or Yemen. Would be very expensive, but one of our brewers, Teo, he loved the smell of myrrh, so we definitely had to have myrrh as part of the bittering agent. And then we had a geneticist from Italy who took a yeast, Saccharomyces baianes, from the Florence-Volterra region and mated it with one Montalcino wine yeast of Cerevisiae to give the yeast that we then used to make this beverage. And so then we tried the 3 different methods. We had special tastings at the Salone del Gusto. These are some of the bottles. And of course, the Etruscans were known for both men and women enjoying their fermented beverages, and they were very fun-loving. So I hope that they really conveyed the feeling that Etrusca had in it as well. So these are just some of the ideas. We have our DeLorean vehicle that we're going to go traveling back into the past to try to find more, and we're working on more. So I hope that I've given you some idea of how inventive and innovative our human species has been in discovering these beverages. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Grazie a voi e dobbiamo assolutamente, visto che siamo fuori tempo, far entrare i prossimi ospiti. Grazie, buona serata.